Okay, chapter 7.7. Right. We're going to be dealing with sine, cosine, and tangent still. But up until this point, we've only been looking and finding when we have a missing side. Okay? So today we're going to learn about when we're looking to find the measure of an angle. And this is what we need to know. When finding angle measures. Okay, so when we're looking to find the measure of an angle, when finding angle measures, we use the inverse trig functions. Right? The inverse trig functions. And they're still sine, cosine, and tangent, but they have a little something extra. Okay? They look like that. Sine to the negative 1. Cosine to the negative 1. Tangent to the negative 1. Alright? They have that little negative 1 there. Okay? When we are looking to find the measure of an angle, that's what we're going to use one of these three. Alright? So, let's say we've got this triangle. We've got that right triangle. And this side is 5. That side's 12. And we want to find the measure of that angle. We want to find the measure of angle x. What does x equal? Okay? Well, let's remember we talked about Oscar had a heap of apples, or SOHCAHTOA if you want to use that one. Okay? Sine, cosine, tangent. We're going to look at our angle that we're trying to find, and we're going to ask ourselves the same questions we did in 7.5 and 7.6. We're going to say, which two sides do we have in relationship to that angle? Right, and if we look, we will see that we have the opposite side, and we have the adjacent side. So because I have the opposite and the adjacent, I'm going to use tangent. Okay, because tangent is opposite over adjacent. Right. And since I'm trying to find an angle measure, that means I'm going to use the inverse. So I'm going to use inverse tangent. All right? So, inverse tangent. All right. And now, earlier when we talked about if I was wanting to find the tangent, remember I put my angle next, and then that equals opposite over adjacent. Okay? That's the angle, and this was the ratio. Okay? This was our ratio, whatever tangent is, which is opposite over adjacent. Okay? All right. Now, when we use the inverse, we're going to flip these two spots. Okay? So now this is going to be our ratio, and this is going to be our angle. Right? So now we're going to say the tangent, the inverse tangent of 5 over 12 is going to equal x. Okay? So in my calculator, if I look at my tangent button and my cosine and sine buttons, okay, if I look right above them in different colors, okay, it's kind of hard to see. They have the inverse functions. Okay? So to get inverse tangent, I'm going to press second. I'm going to press the second button there. Okay? And then I'm going to press tangent, and then we'll see that it comes up inverse tangent. Okay? So we have inverse tangent of 5 divided by 12. 5 over 12. Then I press enter, and I see that the measure of my angle is 22.6 degrees. Okay. So x equals 22.6 degrees. Alright? That's it. Now, sometimes you're going to be asked, you may not be given a triangle. It may just say the sine of, let's say, y equals 10 over 13, let's say. Okay, this is just made up. I just made that up. It has nothing to do with that. Right? But let's say that you are asked to find the measure of y. Okay? Well, all that we have to do is to change it to look like this. So I'm going to take the inverse sine of my ratio, which is 10 over 13, and that's going to equal y. It's going to tell me what y equals. So I would plug that in. I would say second sine, okay, of 10 divided by 13. And that equals 50.3 degrees. So y would equal 50.3 degrees. Okay? And you would do the same thing with sine, inverse cosine. If we had opposite and the hypotenuse, we'd use sine. If we had the adjacent and the hypotenuse, we'd use cosine. Okay? So, quickly, you're going to be asked something like this. It's going to give you directions. You'll be given directions that say, solve the right triangle. Okay? Solve the right triangle. And you'll be given a triangle, maybe something that looks like this. This is 19. This is, let's say, 42, right? Okay, it says solve the right triangle. What that means is that you need to find everything that is missing. Okay? You got to find everything that's missing. So in this case, what we are missing is side AB, angle A, and angle C. Those are the three things we're missing, so that's what we're going to have to find. Alright? So how would we find AB? We're not going to use sine, cosine, and tangent. Right? You've heard me say this before. How do you find the missing side of a right triangle? Right? If we're looking for the missing side of a right triangle, we're going to use Pythagorean theorem. Okay? A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Right? So we'll say that AB is our A value. That's what we're looking for. B is going to be 19. And C, our hypotenuse, is going to be 42. Right? So we get A squared equals 19 squared. A squared plus 19 squared equals 42 squared. Right? So A squared plus 19 squared is 361. And 42 squared is 1764. Right? So we need to subtract 361 from both sides. And we get A squared equals 1403. Right? Now, we want what A equals, not what A squared equals. So we're going to need to take the square root. So, take my calculator, take the square root of 1403 equals 37.5. Okay, 37.5. So I know that this is 37.5. Right. Okay, so one down. Now we've got to find the measure of angle A and the measure of angle C. Right, let's look at the measure of angle A first. Right. To find the measure of angle A, we need to see which sides we have. Right now, I would say let's use 19 and 42 for a couple reasons. Number one, they're whole numbers. They're not a decimal like this. And number two, and for the biggest reason, is because 37.5, remember, we rounded that number. So that's not the exact answer. Right? We had to round it. 19 and 42 are exact because they're the whole numbers. Right? So let's look at 19 and 42 compared to A. Right? Looking at angle A, 19 is the opposite side and 42 is the hypotenuse. Right? Opposite and hypotenuse. I'm going to use sine because sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Right? So I'm going to take sine of my, not of my angle, because remember, we're trying to find the angle measure. So if we're finding the angle measure, we're going to use the inverse. So I'm not just using sine, I'm using the inverse sine. Okay? So the inverse sine, remember sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Opposite is 19 over hypotenuse, which is 42. Right? And that will tell me what the measure of angle A equals. Right? So I take my calculator, I say second sine 19 divided by 42, like so. I press enter, and I would get 26.9 degrees. Right? So that equals 26.9 degrees. Okay. So now all we have left is to find the measure of angle C. Two ways that I can think of that we can do this. Number one, and the easiest way that I would say is, you know that angle A plus angle C should equal 90 degrees, right? Because three angles in a triangle, they add up to 180. There's 90 of it already. So A and C are going to add up to 90. So really all we have to do is say 90 minus 26.9, and that will give us the measure of angle C. Right? Okay? And that would give a 90 minus 26.9, and that would give us 63.1 degrees. Right? That's the right answer. Now let's say we didn't think about doing that, and we said, alright, I'm going to look at C, and I'm going to use one of my trig functions. Right? So let's look at 19 and 42. From angle C, 19 is the adjacent side, 42 is the hypotenuse. So I'm going to use cosine, because cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. Right? And since we're finding the angle measure, we're going to use the inverse. So inverse cosine of adjacent, which is 19, over hypotenuse, which is 42. And that should give us what C equals. If I put that in my calculator, second cosine 19 divided by 42, and press enter, you would get 63.1 degrees. 63.1, which is what we had. Right? So this is 63.1 degrees. So if you're asked to solve the right triangle, that's what it means. You have to find everything that's missing. Okay? Alright, you really need to know for 7, 5, 7, 6, 7, 7, you have to know sine is opposite over hypotenuse, cosine adjacent over hypotenuse, tangent opposite over adjacent. Right? When we are trying to find the angle measures, you have to use the inverse to find the angle measures. Right? Make sure that your calculators are in degree mode, and make sure you remember either Oscar had a heap of apples or the SOHCAHTOA, one of those two. Alright? You can find your homework on RenWeb.